Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to talk about my overall thoughts about Season 3. And overall, I do think this season is much better than Season 1 and 2. However, it still has a lot of flaws which I discussed in detail in my reviews of every episode, such as the Changelings being weaker and different than what they should have been, but at least there is some kind of an excuse in the show itself for those differences, and also that whole mystery of Jack Crusher, which was a little bit annoying because of how long it took them to reveal it, but overall I do think it was good. I do like how they did have clues all throughout the season from the start, but they made it vague enough as not to be too obvious, and yet when you look back, it does help to connect it all better and make it more believable, so overall I do kind of like it. And as for the Borg themselves, the only thing I didn't really like in the end is how easy it was to defeat them and how lucky everything was, and that whole epilogue in the end, how they explain a lot of things away in one line of dialogue, felt a little bit rushed and silly and kind of badly written. For example, from the beginning of the show they said that Jack has a whole bunch of criminal charges against him. Even by Federation standards he's considered a criminal. I guess he can prove himself innocent, but wouldn't it take a while to go through the courts and to figure out that all those charges were bogus or whatever? And Beverly was also with him. He said that they're equal partners in all their criminal activities and so on. So how come she becomes an admiral and he becomes an ensign just 1 year later? So all those other charges got dropped immediately. And so everything is kind of too rushed and convenient in the end, so that's a big flaw in the final episode in my opinion. How quickly they wrapped everything up and how convenient and easy everything was, so it almost makes it all feel very unrealistic, almost as if it's all a dream by someone. My favorite scene in the whole series is in the end of episode 9 when they come aboard the Enterprise D again, and in a way all of season 3 was kind of set up just as a way to get to that moment in a way that doesn't feel too contrived. Like the way they set up the whole season made it seem kind of natural for them to end up there in a way that makes sense. And they could have got to that point a lot easier and faster, but it would have been contrived and silly. They could have said early in the season that Picard is celebrating his 100th birthday, and so all his old friends come to visit him, and then the Borg suddenly attack them, and then they go to the Enterprise D immediately, and so it would have been fun, but it would have been a lot more silly. So I do kind of like the way that they carefully set up the events in the season to end up on the bridge of the Enterprise D in a way that doesn't feel silly, that feels kind of natural in the story. And also the way that all the TNG characters kind of gradually showed up in the show also in a way that makes sense, and not just all showed up to Picard's birthday or something like that. So I do like the overall way that the season did it, and the acting was really good by everyone, and especially Jonathan Frakes I think was amazing in this season, and even Patrick Stewart was much better here compared to the previous two seasons, in which he didn't even feel like the same character, and yet here he actually feels like Captain Picard again. And even the drama between all the characters was something that they did even better than in TNG in some ways, because as much as I love TNG, it did have some flaws, and because that show was so episodic, it was kind of limiting the relationships between the TNG crew, and yet here they play with it a lot more, and they gave Beverly a much bigger role than ever before, and every cast member contributed something. They were not just there in the background just to be there like in some of the movies, but here they all played a part in the story. And the way they brought Data back was also not too convenient, not too easy. They made it like a challenge that he has to overcome first before he can come back as Data. And so overall I do kind of like it. There were a few disappointments, especially because of the trailer made it look as if Moriarty will play a big role in the season and Lore will be a big villain in the season, and in the end their appearances were very short, and so I even described it as clickbait, the way they showed them in the trailer, and then they didn't really do that much in the season. But it was still nice to see them, and so if not for the trailer it wouldn't have annoyed me so much, and I wouldn't be as much disappointed, because it would still be a nice surprise in the show to see them. And the scenes themselves were pretty good, and so that's why I'm less angry about it now than I was initially. I think my biggest disappointment in this season is how underutilized were the Changelings, how weak they were in the whole season. And I know it's because of budget restraints and stuff like that, but back when they were making Deep Space Nine, special effects were much more expensive than today, and yet they were still able to play with the Changelings in a lot of fun ways. which were a lot more exciting and interesting and clever, and there were all those paranoia episodes of someone pretending to be a changeling and you don't know who it was and all of that. So Deep Space Nine did it a lot better than how it was done in the show. And at least they did have an excuse here for why these changelings are different, so maybe they're not as agile and not as quick to morph, but they are harder to detect. And I'm fine with that idea in general, because it makes sense that after the Dominion War that Starfleet would develop better ways to detect changelings, and so saying that these changelings are different and harder to detect, it's a fine idea, but the problem is in the details, as I explained. Like, they say that they can now pass blood tests, but they could already do it in Deep Space Nine. It was established that the Martok that we saw in season 4 of Deep Space Nine, who in his first scene was cutting his hand and bleeding on the table, and that ended up being a changeling because the real Martok was locked away in a Dominion prison, and it was mentioned that Klingons are obsessed with blood tests, and yet the changeling Martok was able to pass all those tests. And so obviously the blood tests alone were not enough to catch changelings. They were able to find ways around it, as was explained by Sisko's father, that a changeling can simply keep someone's blood inside of him and let it out on cue when someone was testing him. So changelings were already extremely hard to detect, and if you scan them you wouldn't detect anything because they could change their molecular structure, including presumably creating the internal organs and all of that. And I do kind of like the idea that a transporter would be the most effective way to detect a changeling. It's strange that no one mentioned it back in Deep Space Nine, because when you literally break someone to teleport them and you obviously analyze their entire body as they're being transported, and so that would be the most logical way to detect them. So I kind of liked it how in this season they implied that the first thing the changelings did was replace all the transporter chiefs with changelings, because presumably that way they can falsify all the transporter logs and prevent them from being detected. In the end, it turns out it was part of the Borg plot to implant everyone with the Borg DNA and so on. So I wish it was stated it was also for the reason of preventing the changelings from being detected. So at least they did have the excuse that these changelings were modified to have internal organs and to be able to bleed and be much harder to detect. All of it is fine, but it's still disappointing that the changelings were much weaker than the ones in Deep Space Nine, and so all the action scenes with the changelings were kind of lame, and it felt like a missed opportunity because it could have been a lot better. And if they didn't have the budget to do the changelings properly in the show, they could have simply used the conspiracy bugs from way back in season 1 of TNG, which is what I initially thought they were going to do, which I still think it could have been a cool idea on its own. It would have felt a little bit more original because it wasn't done that many times in Star Trek itself, and also because that episode of season 1 of TNG was left on a cliffhanger, it always annoyed me that they never wrapped up that story. And they could have still done the Borg twist in the end. They could have revealed that the Borg at some point assimilated those bugs and maybe upgraded them. Maybe the Borg are the ones that modified those bugs to make them less detectable, maybe because they now have nanoprobes in them. They're able to cloak themselves inside the human body so as not to get detected, and obviously no longer needing that little breathing tube coming out of the neck and all of that, so they wouldn't be detectable by normal means until the very end of the season. Maybe after they defeat the Borg, all the nanoprobes in those bags would stop working and then they can detect them again. And so I think it would have been more interesting and would have made more sense in the end of how everyone got possessed by the Borg. Simply say those are the conspiracy bugs who use the transporters to implant their eggs into most of Starfleet, and then when those eggs hatch, then they took over everyone. It would make more sense logically, scientifically, more than what we saw that the Borg sent a transmission, and because everyone has some undetectable piece of DNA, that makes it possible for the Borg to possess them from afar with a transmission. All of that seems a little bit far-fetched compared to the simpler idea of brain bugs being in everyone and the Borg controlling them. That would have made so much more sense. And I think it would have been better off for this season overall, because since, as I said, they barely use the shape-shifting powers anyway, so this way they wouldn't have any shape-shifting powers. All they have to do is show a few cool scenes of the bugs going into people or going out of people, and the rest you can just have people being controlled by them and have more normal action scenes of fighting the possessed people who are stronger than normal people, but they wouldn't have shape-shifting powers. Now, if they did have the budget to do the changelings properly, then obviously changelings would be a better idea because they are a lot more fun. You can do a lot more things with them. If you use their abilities properly, it could have been a more challenging villain. And so what I would have done is maybe bring back that subplot of those 100 changelings who got sent away by the Founders, who were mentioned a lot of times in Deep Space Nine, but we only got to see one of them. Technically, we saw one who was a baby who merged with Odo in the end, and another one in the final season of Deep Space Nine who was even able to turn into space creatures flying at warp, and he was able to turn himself into fire and into a cloud, and so he seemed to be much more powerful changeling than any other we saw in the show. And it also shows you the potential of the changelings, that they can literally change their atomic structure and they can become energy and all kinds of crazy things, and so it seems way more powerful than what we saw in this show. And they could have explained away the weaker powers by saying that he got infected by Odo. You know, in that episode where he met Odo, Odo didn't yet know that he carries that virus, and he linked with Lass, and in the end of that episode, Lass went away to find the other 100 changelings who got sent away. So presumably he got infected by that same virus from Odo, and maybe he did find many of those other 100 changelings and infected them too, and then they all got sick. And maybe then they went to Starfleet for help because the Dominion War was over. They knew that Starfleet had the cure. So maybe they naively came to Starfleet seeking their help. And then Starfleet locks them away and begins experimenting on them, what we see in those flashback scenes. So that would have been even darker and more cruel, and would explain why they're so angry later, because they didn't even have anything to do with the Dominion War. They were not responsible for that, and yet they were still locked away and experimented on and tortured. Then it would explain why they're so angry, and they could say that maybe because of those experiments they got mutated, and that's why they're so different now and more limited. Now the problem it would have is the limitation of their numbers. They wouldn't have been able to take all of Starfleet if there's less than 100 of them. Now in the actual episode we saw that there were only 10 changelings who were in that lab, and so they said that they can pass down those modifications to other changelings if they link with them. So presumably they did have a large number of changelings who came from the Great Link, and maybe Odo didn't yet know what they're planning to do, only that they are going to the Alpha Quadrant again, and then they met up with Vadik and became like her. And another question that keeps bugging me is what happened with the female founder from Deep Space Nine. I guess she got locked up for her war crimes in the end, but you know, the Federation is against the death penalty, and so presumably she's still in prison. So wouldn't these changelings try to free her? And so I think that was a missed opportunity. Maybe Vadik should have been her. And as for the Borg coming back again, I know it probably annoyed a few people because the Borg have been overdone so many times, and each time they appear they get weaker and weaker every time, and so I understand people who got disappointed by that. I still think overall it fits the show simply because it ties directly with Picard as a character. He is the main character of the show, and that is a big part of his backstory, and especially with this whole story of his son inheriting something from his past, and so it all kind of fits together well in the end, and so that's why I do think it was okay in the end. I wish it would have been done better. I wish the Borg would not be so weak as we saw in the end, and the only explanation we have for that is that it was all a result of Janeway's virus, and so it seems to have been more devastating for the Borg than we thought. And another problem in this season is they completely ignored the events of the previous season. You know, Jurati and her collective, how come they never asked her help in this season? It's as if they completely forgot she existed. And as much as I disliked the previous two seasons, I dislike even more the idea of completely ignoring them, because, you know, I don't like loose ends. I don't like the fact that we never got an explanation for that energy beam that someone sent to destroy all life in the previous season. My headcanon is that it's the same robotic tentacles we saw in the end of season 1. Maybe they were angry that they were not allowed to enter our galaxy, and so they decided to send that beam of energy instead. So that's my headcanon. That's the only way to tie everything together and explain it. So I would have liked at least some kind of mention of previous events and not just completely ignoring it. There's even a line in this season of Beverly saying that no one heard from the Borg in 10 years, and so she completely is unaware of the whole Jurati plot from season 2. Or does this season take place 10 years after the previous one? That actually would have been a neat way to solve some of the continuity issue I had with it, like Jack looking like a 40-year-old man, and that flashback scene of Jack coming to meet him in Guinan's bar, and Picard saying that he came to that bar so often, and yet back in season 2 when he first came into that bar, he looked around as if it's his first time there. He was completely surprised of that bar being in that address that sounds like 10 forward, so he was smiling about it, and so it was obviously the first time he was there back in season 2. And yet in this season, he was apparently a regular at that bar, and Jack visited him there when he was a teenager, and so it doesn't seem to fit. So if they simply set this season 10 years after the previous one, it would have fixed some of those issues, and yet they kept saying it's been 35 years since they all know each other, and so that means it's taking place around the same time as season 2, and so it's as if they just ignored season 2 completely. And that is kind of annoying to me, because even though I disliked season 2, I would have liked it to somehow been addressed better. And also they could have used the events of the previous season to explain what the hell happened with the Borg. They could have said, Jurati took over most of the collective, and that's why this evil queen was left with so little. That would have explained it better. And also they could have said that this evil Borg queen is the same one who escaped from that cube we saw in season 1 of Picard, the one that experienced that admonition vision because it assimilated a Romulan who saw that vision, and that it somehow crippled that Borg cube, and yet the Borg queen escaped using that portal that was there. So it could have been the same queen, and so maybe because she saw that admonition vision which showed that AI will destroy all life in the galaxy, maybe that's what made her change her way and start becoming more biological than mechanical. Maybe because of seeing that vision, it drove her crazy, and so that's why she's now using an organic way to possess people and assimilate people organically rather than technologically. And that entire final confrontation with this queen, all of it was kind of too easy and too convenient in a kind of Star Warsy way. Oh, you just have to blow something up inside the cube, and it blows up the entire cube, and the queen lowered her own defenses to allow Picard in for some reason, which was silly. And so I don't like stupid villains, and so I don't like the way that the villains were defeated way too easily in the end. I made a whole video talking about how I would have done things differently, which would have been more interesting in my opinion, so check that video out if you didn't see it already, because I'm not going to repeat all of that here. So there were a lot of missed opportunities in my opinion, and even early on, the whole reason for Beverly keeping Jack a secret from Picard was to prevent Picard's enemies from going after him because of the many assassination attempts on his life. That's when she decided not to tell him about his kid, because of all those assassination attempts on his life by all kinds of enemies he had in the galaxy. And I think there was a missed opportunity, because I was always annoyed across this entire series how they never once mentioned Picard's brother and nephew dying in a fire, presumably in the vineyard, which he then inherited. And they constantly try to make Picard's character so tragic. In season 1 he's so sad about Data dying, and in season 2 he's so sad because his mother killed herself when he was a kid. And so constantly they try to do these tragic backstories for Picard, and completely ignoring the fact that his only remaining family died horribly in a fire was never once mentioned, and how come he lives in that vineyard in which they died presumably, and whatever happened with the wife of his brother who he didn't say died also. What happened with her? How come she's not the one who inherited the vineyard? Did she hang herself in the vineyard? And so how is he so comfortable living in the vineyard in which his remaining family died horribly? So I think it should have been addressed somewhere across the series, and yet it never once was mentioned. And maybe it would have been interesting to reveal that their death was not actually an accident. Maybe some of his enemies in the galaxy who wanted revenge on him had sent someone to kill his family, and it could have been used as part of that scene of Beverly listing all the times people tried to kill him. And if she said, people actually sent someone to kill your family in the past, and that's why Renee and Robert died in the fire, and I didn't want something like that to happen to Jack, and that's why I kept him secret, that would have made perfect sense and would have helped explain all of it. And also it would have tied that loose end of how exactly his family died and why, and maybe could have given Picard kind of a revenge story somewhere in the series if it was one of the villains in the series who did that. It would have added something, I think. It obviously wouldn't have been the Borg who sent assassins to do that, but maybe the conspiracy bugs would fit perfectly, because remember, Picard is the one who killed their mother creature back in season 1 of TNG. So maybe some of the bug creatures would be really angry about that because that was their mother. So maybe it was a conspiracy bug who wanted revenge on Picard, and that's why it went and killed his family on Earth. And maybe they also killed Riker's kid for the same reason, because Riker and Picard were the ones that killed the mother creature. And so they wanted revenge, and maybe they made the deaths look like accidents or diseases, as not to tip off anyone about their new conspiracy, their new plans to take over the Federation again. So I still think that, the TNG bugs would have been better than the Changelings in this season. And especially because it could have been used as a retcon to explain away why Starfleet was so evil, as we saw in season 1 of Picard. How come Starfleet refused to save the Romulans from the supernova? They kicked Picard out of Starfleet. They behaved in a nasty way. They enslaved those androids on Mars. That cursing admiral could have come back in this season and have been revealed to be a conspiracy bug, and then Picard would vaporize her face like he did in season 1 of TNG, and then all the bugs would come out. They could have explained the nasty Starfleet stuff by using the conspiracy bug as a scapegoat, by saying all those evil things that we saw Starfleet do, it was always the conspiracy bugs doing it, and now we finally managed to detect all of them and exorcise all of them out of Starfleet, and Starfleet will once again be a good organization like it's supposed to be in the vision of Gene Roddenberry. So that would have been a perfect way to explain all the evil, nasty stuff that we saw Starfleet do in all the new Trek shows. Of course, it could have been silly, but I think it would have been entertaining, and especially I would have enjoyed them wrapping up that loose end from TNG, because I don't like loose ends, I don't like all the forgotten plot lines. And what about those giant tentacles from season 1 of Picard? I personally would have explained it by connecting the two, and also, they had the portal weapon in this season. I would have explained that it came from that technology of the android planet. Maybe that was all confiscated and that became the portal weapon. And also the fact that the portal weapon was only used once in one episode of the season, and that's a shame, because that was such a cool idea, and when I first saw it I thought they were going to play with it more in the end, that there are going to be more action scenes in space using those portal weapons, and it can be a cool idea to play with, and yet they just abandoned that in the nebula and never used it again. So that was also a missed opportunity. They could have used that to get into the Borg cube in the end in a way that will make much more sense than the Borg queen just opening up her own defenses for no reason, which makes her stupid. And I do admit that some of my nitpicks can be explained away with some creative thinking, and so in those cases where it can be easily explained without contradicting anything else, then I am more than happy to accept the explanation, and I'll offer a few points myself. I previously complained how come the Enterprise D in the final episode of the show, it was simply flying around like an X-Wing inside the huge Borg cube, which is also in close proximity to Jupiter, which is a massive gravity well. So maybe inside the cube there is artificial gravity and it is shielded from the outside gravity, and so the gravity of Jupiter might not be affecting the inside of the cube. And we also know that the drive section of this rebuilt Enterprise is not from the original Enterprise D, that it comes from some other Galaxy class ship, and so they added a lot of modifications and upgrades to it, and so maybe that's what allows this ship to be much more maneuverable than the Enterprise D, because the drive section of it was highly improved because of the war or something like that. So we can add excuses and explanations to explain away such differences, and I'm totally fine with it in this case. It's a perfectly reasonable explanation. The drive section is of some other ship which was maybe a later model with additional upgrades, and that's why it's so much faster. So I'm totally fine with it. One other thing I love in this season is how it not only uses the previous material, the old shows and movies, to build upon it, but also it ties back to them in a way that makes sense, that ties up loose ends and explains a few things which were never explained. For example, in the movie First Contact, we saw that Picard is able to somehow hear the Borg collective despite not having any implants anymore, which was never explained in that movie, and so here they tie back to that and explain it. So that's something I love. That's what a good sequel should do. Not just try to imitate and recycle the old stuff, but actually do a continuation of the story, and in a way that even improves the older story, that makes it even better. And it can even be used to explain something which annoyed me back in season 1 of Picard, in the last episode of season 1, when Soji was sending that transmission to the evil AI tentacles to invite them into our galaxy. Somehow, coincidentally, Picard suddenly started dying when he tried to stop all of it. As Soji was sending that transmission, Picard suddenly had a pain in his brain and started to die. And back then I complained about it, saying what a remarkable coincidence that he's just about to die just as he needs to talk with Soji and to convince her, and his Iromodic syndrome kicks in at that exact moment. And so looking back now, knowing that his syndrome was actually a receiver of Borg transmissions, maybe that beacon that Soji was sending to the evil AI had a similar frequency to Borg transmissions, and so maybe that's what affected his syndrome and caused him to die. Maybe because of that massive transmission that she was sending into space, and he was on a starship right next to that beam, and so maybe because his brain is a receiver, that's what caused what we saw on screen. He suddenly was in pain in his brain and then died. And I remember I was complaining about this coincidence in that episode, but knowing what we know now in season 3, that can actually be used to explain that. And I'll be making videos with all of that stuff on my other channel to demonstrate all of these points back to back. And by the way, my other channel is not monetized by me. If you do see any ads, it's not from me, it's because of copyright claims by other companies. I'm only making those videos for fun and for you guys to enjoy. If you wish to support me in my projects, you can help through my Patreon, which I link on this channel. It will greatly help me out. It will allow me to spend more time for all my projects, and so big thanks for all of your support there. Let me know what you think and we can discuss everything in the comments section below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.